So, I was watching the new Critical Role campaign, and I promise this isn't another video where I just talk about Critical Role the whole time. But one of the new characters did catch my eye. There will be minor spoilers, nothing major, but I did want to talk about it, and a phenomenon that I've noticed that I think is very interesting. So, as long as you're okay with slight Critical Role Campaign 3 spoilers, let's go ahead and get started. So Laura Bailey is playing a new character named Imogen. She seems like a very sweet and sort of shy character who has the ability to reach into other people's minds. She has the ability to feel and understand and connect telepathically. And it's interesting the way she's begun to play it, because I've noticed that Imogen is anxious. Very, very anxious. She's very scared of a lot of crowds, because when she does so, when she goes into a large group of areas, she can feel everybody. She can sense them. And it begins to overwhelm her senses and cause her to just not be able to focus. She begins to feel anxiety. And it seems very much like Laura is trying to play this character as somebody who has very clear social anxiety. And she's showing that through their telepathic abilities. Because they are telepathic, they have anxiety of being around people. And I've noticed something. I've noticed through a lot of different D&D games that I play and games that I've seen played and different media that I've watched. It's very interesting that people tend to relate real emotional or psychological issues with magical effects. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, Imogen, she has this ability to connect to people through telepathy, and that's why she has this anxiety. That's why she's afraid of being around people. But that's not an issue that can only happen when you're telepathic. I know a lot of people, myself included, when in a large space, they just begin to feel overwhelmed, overstimulated. It's like your brain shuts down because there's just too much stimuli coming in. There's so many sounds and people, and you feel so much, your eyes are seeing so much, your ears are just overwhelmed, and your brain shuts down. Suddenly, you just can't do anything. I've experienced that before. I know other people have too. It doesn't have to be telepathy that causes that, but she's using that telepathy to show that feeling. That's very interesting to me, and there's more people who have done it than just that. Take, for example, the Unsleeping City from Dimension 20. There's a character in there named Pete, and he's played by Ali, and he's a great character. I love him so much. He is somebody who has gone through the process of transitioning, and the way that Ali shows that is very, very interesting. Pete is a sorcerer. He's a wild magic sorcerer. It's very interesting the way that they use his sorcery and the power that he has within him to represent the fact that they have already changed, that they are going through this change, that something's going on inside of them. Pete did not ask for this wild magic sorcery. It is a power innate within them that just comes out and causes weird things to happen that other people around them don't understand. You see where I'm going with that? It's the same thing with their transitioning. It's something they didn't ask for. It's something inside of them trying to get out, and it's something that people around them don't understand. And this is something that you can notice if you begin to look everywhere. There's a strange phenomenon where TV shows, media, it shows these different mental health issues through a supernatural means. Take, for example, the Hulk. The Hulk represents a rage which you can't describe. It represents more than just anger issues. It represents trauma. It represents the idea of something happening that causes you to have to defend yourself, whether you like it or not, because you lash out when anything happens, because your brain remembers that traumatic event and will not let that happen to you again. It's a very interesting phenomenon that happens over and over again. I wanted to ask the question, why is it that we have to use those magical means, these supernatural events, to display these mental health issues? Why must we use that to help understand? Why is that necessary instead of just showing a character with those issues? Well, people do show characters with those issues, but it's different, I think, when they have a supernatural means of representing it. And why is that? Well, it helps people who don't have those issues understand. If you were to come up to me and say, hey, I have depression. Well, if I don't have depression, that doesn't make sense. How many people in the world, when somebody says, hey, I have depression, they say, well, just cheer up, go on a walk, go exercise. Yeah, it doesn't work that way. It never has. But they couldn't possibly understand because they've never felt that. They've never felt a sadness that just pushes itself there, an indifference to life like that, that heavy weight that lays on your shoulders and keeps you from getting up in the morning. They've never experienced it, so how could they understand? But then take, for example, a TV show that shows this magical effect, say a disease that causes the happiness to leave your life, that causes you to feel indifferent towards everything, to no longer be able to see anything that makes good, to just remove the color out of the world. Of course, they're going to be able to better relate to that because they can put themselves in these footsteps of, what if I was infected by this magical disease? suddenly it makes sense that the brain would change and move things around because it's something that is not something that would exist in the world. So they can imagine what it might be like, because their brain does not automatically think, well, I've never seen that, so it wouldn't exist. Because of course it doesn't exist. So they can suspend their disbelief. But then take the other side of the coin. If there is something that somebody's asking them to understand, which they're saying does actually exist, but they've never seen before, a lot of people will just automatically take that and run away with it. Say, no, well, I've never seen it. Doesn't make any sense. You're just being over dramatic. And that's where I think it's interesting. We can take these characters with these supernatural, magical, different scenarios, and we can show what it's like to feel those things. Is it a one-for-one? Of course, absolutely not. Somebody with social anxiety or somebody who gets overstimulated in a crowd doesn't have telepathy. They don't get overstimulated because they can feel everybody's thoughts and emotions and connect to them on that level. But they do get overstimulated. They do get overwhelmed. And regardless of the reason of why it happens, it does happen. And this helps people understand that. I released 2 videos talking about a story that's happening in my campaign currently. Basically, the characters met this eldritch deity who had kind of just been born. So rather than being the unknowing, super powerful, entirely uncontainable thing that it should have been, it latched on to the characters. And it began to try and relate itself to them because it had no other frame of reference. And they kept referring to it as a he, but they began to realize that maybe they weren't a he. They didn't understand gender, but they had no other reference than to see these people as gender, and so it began to think. And eventually it decided that it was a he-they, but it had to come to that conclusion itself. I myself would not have understood that. I could not understand that, but when I was sitting in the footsteps of this creature that just didn't have gender, I was looking at something that didn't exist, so I could put my feet in its shoes without having to sit there and think, with having my brain getting in the way of saying, well, you've never seen something like that in real life. Suddenly, all that went away, and I was just able to understand what that might be like. Now, have I experienced it? No, and I'm not saying that I have, but I have a better understanding now. And that's where this becomes important. Because when they're experiencing those things in this fantasy setting, our brain no longer has to try and rationalize everything. Why do you think it's so easy for certain cartoon shows to get away with LGBTQ plus relationships even when there's such heavy censorship? Now, do they get pushback on it? Yes, but think about Steven Universe. They got away with a lot of that for a long time in an era where that wasn't something that you did. And why? Well, they were fantasy alien rock things. They weren't actually gendered, so they could get away with it. It was easy enough for the studio execs to kind of push that back because the brain wasn't fighting that hard on it, because they didn't actually exist. Now, eventually, the show did have problems with that, and it caused some issues with their production. But I think the point still stands. It is easier for a brain to not have to fight against those things in a fantasy setting. It's something that doesn't actually exist, so we actually can't put our footsteps in it. We can't actually wear their shoes and understand, at least somewhat. Now, does this mean that you just make these characters and automatically everybody understands? No. I think a point has to be made with them. I think it has to be made clear that that's what you're doing. You're representing this so that people can understand it, and it is up to us to choose to understand that character, to put ourselves in their shoes. But I do think it is a very valuable tool for understanding other people. And I'm very excited to see where else the D&D community might be able to go with this. Anyways, thanks for enjoying my random rambling. Go out into the world, make it your own, you beautiful bastards. Don't forget to have a great day, and never forget to play your own. Thank you. Coming up.